Zefkari stood on the bridge of the Harmony's edge and watched three human ships approach through the darkness of space. His four eyes tracked their movement with the cold precision that made the Veltar the most feared warriors in the galaxy. These ships looked wrong to him. Where Veltar vessels displayed smooth curves and perfect engineering, the human ships appeared crude and blocky. Their hulls bore scars and patches that spoke of countless repairs. No proper military force would allow such shabby appearance. The lead ship identified itself as the UES Liberty. Behind it came the UES Defiance and the UES Resilience. Even their names seemed foolish to Zefkari. Veltar ships carried names like Perfect Strike and Flawless Victory. These humans named their vessels after emotions and abstract concepts. It revealed much about their primitive thinking. Admiral Kethvar of the Coalition fleet had summoned all commanders to discuss the approaching threat. The Kreshnak horde was moving toward the colony world of New Geneva. Intelligence reports counted 200 enemy vessels. The Coalition could muster only 80 ships to defend 3 million civilians. Standard military doctrine was clear in such situations. Evacuation followed by strategic withdrawal to prepared defensive positions. Zefkari had fought the Kreshnak before. They were savage creatures who fed on fear and suffering. Their ships were fast and brutal. Their weapons designed not just to kill, but to cause maximum terror. They would broadcast the screams of their victims across all frequencies. They would torture captured civilians in full view of defending forces. Breaking enemy morale was their primary tactic. The briefing room filled with representatives from a dozen species. Veltar, Korash, Delani, and others who had proven themselves in battle. Then the humans entered. Zefkari studied them with professional interest. They appeared unremarkable. 2 eyes, standard bipedal form, no visible natural weapons. Their uniforms were clean but showed signs of wear. The lead human introduced himself as Captain Jake Morrison. He was followed by Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez and Sergeant Pete Collins. Captain Morrison moved with confidence but lacked the rigid bearing Zefkari expected from military personnel. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried no formal authority. Markers. Lieutenant Rodriguez appeared young even by human standards. Sergeant Collins seemed older and carried himself like a veteran, but his equipment included a primitive metal blade alongside advanced energy weapons. Strange choice for a modern soldier. Admiral Kethvar began the tactical briefing. The Kreshnak fleet would arrive in 36 hours. Coalition doctrine called for immediate civilian evacuation. Military forces would establish defensive positions around the third moon of New Geneva. From there they could conduct hit-and-run attacks while evacuation proceeded. When civilian ships reached safety, military forces would withdraw to the Centaur defense grid. The plan made perfect sense to Zefkari. It minimized casualties while maximizing strategic advantage. The Kreshnak would waste time and resources, conquering an empty world. Meanwhile, coalition forces would regroup at a fortified position. Standard military thinking applied properly. Captain Morrison raised his hand. With respect, Admiral, we need to discuss the evacuation timeline, Sir. Civilian ships can carry approximately 50,000 people per trip, Admiral Kethvar replied. With current vessel availability, complete evacuation requires 60 trips. Estimated time is 48 hours minimum. And the Kreshnak arrive in 36 hours, Morrison said. Correct. We will delay their advance as long as possible. Morrison looked at his fellow humans. Some kind of silent communication passed between them. Zefkari had seen this before with species that formed pack bonds. Primitive but sometimes effective for small unit cohesion. Admiral, we're not abandoning those people, Morrison said quietly. The room fell silent. Zefkari felt his scales shift in surprise. Was this human questioning established military doctrine? Captain Morrison, the tactical situation is clear, Admiral Kethvar explained patiently. Enemy forces outnumber us more than 2 to 1. Direct engagement would result in total fleet destruction with minimal impact on enemy capabilities. Maybe for other fleets, Lieutenant Rodriguez said. Her voice was steady but carried something Zefkari could not identify. We hold the line here. Sergeant Collins nodded. 3 million people, Admiral. That's not a number, that's 3 million individual lives, families, children. We don't leave them. Zefkari studied the humans with growing confusion. They seemed to understand the tactical situation clearly. Their questions during the briefing proved they grasped the strategic implications. Yet they appeared willing to ignore mathematical reality. This made no sense from any logical military perspective. The evacuation timeline is fixed by physical limitations. Admiral Kethvar continued. We cannot move people faster than available. Transport allows. Then we buy more time, Morrison said simply. At what cost, Captain? Whatever it takes. The phrase sent a chill through Zefkari's nervous system. In Veltar military culture, acceptable losses were calculated precisely. Mission parameters included specific casualty limits. No objective was worth unlimited sacrifice. These humans seemed to operate by completely different principles. Commander Yaxtel of the Karash Empire leaned forward. Captain Morrison, your species is new to coalition military operations. Perhaps you do not fully understand Kreshnak capabilities. We understand them fine, Pete Collins replied. His hand rested casually on that primitive blade. The question is whether they understand us. The Kreshnak have conquered 47 star systems, Commander Yaxtel continued. They have defeated fleets twice our size. Their psychological warfare breaks enemy resistance before physical combat begins. Maya Rodriguez smiled. The expression looked wrong to Zefkari, too calm for someone discussing inevitable death. Commander, respectfully, we don't break. The briefing continued for another hour. Coalition forces would maintain standard defensive posture. Human vessels would integrate into the battle line according to established protocols. All commanders would follow Admiral Kethvar's orders during engagement. The humans agreed to these arrangements without argument. Yet Zefkari sensed something beneath their compliance. These creatures were planning something. Their body language spoke of hidden intentions. When they thought no one was watching, they exchanged glances that carried meaning he could not decipher. After the briefing, Zefkari found himself walking beside Captain Morrison toward the docking bays. Professional curiosity compelled him to speak. Captain, your species appears committed to defending New Geneva despite tactical disadvantages. That's correct. May I ask what strategic objective justifies such risk? Morrison stopped walking and turned to face him. For a moment, Zefkari saw something in those strange two-eyed features that made his scales ripple involuntarily. There are 3 million people down there who are going to wake up tomorrow morning and make breakfast for their kids, Morrison said quietly. They're going to go to work and complain about their bosses and worry about paying bills and plan what to do on the weekend. Normal, everyday, boring life. The Kreshnak want to turn that into screaming in death and horror. He paused, and that strange expression grew stronger. We're going to stop them. But Captain, the odds don't matter. Those people matter. Everything else is just details. Morrison continued toward his ship, leaving Zefkari standing alone in the corridor. For the first time in his military career, the veteran Veltar warrior found himself genuinely confused about human tactical thinking. They seemed to operate by principles that defied rational military analysis. He would understand soon enough. 24 hours remained before the Kreshnak fleet would arrive at New Geneva. Zefkari spent the time observing human preparations through the fleet communication network. What he saw made no sense according to any military manual he had studied. The UES Liberty broadcast something called country music across all human frequencies. Zefkari listened to the strange sounds with growing bewilderment. The music spoke of lost loves, distant homes, and simple pleasures. Why were warriors listening to emotional content before battle? Veltar forces prepared with tactical drills and meditation exercises designed to sharpen focus. These humans seemed to be deliberately softening their mental state. On the UES Defiance, Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez gathered her crew in what appeared to be a ceremonial formation. Through the security cameras, Zefkari watched them recite something they called the Sailor's Creed. The words spoke of honor, courage, and commitment. Standard military oath material, but delivered with an intensity that seemed excessive for routine pre-battle protocol. The most puzzling behavior came from Sergeant Pete Collins on the UES Resilience. The man sat in his quarters methodically sharpening that primitive metal blade. His movements showed decades of practice. The edge already appeared perfect, yet he continued the ritual with mechanical precision. Advanced energy weapons hung within, easy reach, but he focused entirely on maintaining a tool that belonged in a museum. During a tactical planning session, the humans proposed modifications to standard coalition battle formations. Captain Morrison suggested tighter ship spacing and more aggressive forward positioning. Maya Rodriguez recommended abandoning the traditional reserve formation in favor of full commitment from initial contact. Pete Collins wanted to reduce the standard engagement range by 60%. These modifications increase casualty projections significantly, Admiral Kethvar pointed out during the strategy meeting. Only if you assume we're planning to take casualties, Jake Morrison replied. All military operations involve acceptable loss calculations, Captain, not ours. Zefkari studied the tactical displays with professional expertise. Human suggestions violated established military doctrine developed over thousands of years of galactic warfare. Proper fleet engagement maintained specific distances to maximize weapon effectiveness while minimizing vulnerability. Ships operated in mutually supporting formations that allowed damaged vessels to withdraw for repair. Reserve forces provided flexibility to exploit opportunities or respond to unexpected threats. The human modifications eliminated these safety measures. Their proposed formation would commit all forces immediately. No withdrawal options, no tactical flexibility, no acceptable loss parameters. It resembled a suicide charge more than a military operation. Captain Morrison, Commander Yaxetel interjected, your formation proposals appear designed to maximize close-quarters engagement. The Kreshnok prefer such combat. You would be playing to their strengths. Maybe, Pete Collins said. Or maybe, we know something about close-quarters combat that they don't. The Kreshnok have perfected boarding actions across 47 conquered systems, Yaxetel continued. Their warriors are bred for personal combat. They feed on the terror of hand-to-hand fighting. Maya Rodriguez looked up from her tactical display. Then they're going to starve. The words carried such quiet confidence that Zefkari felt his scales shift involuntarily. These humans spoke of facing the galaxy's most feared warriors, as if discussing routine maintenance duties. Either they possessed information not available to coalition intelligence, or they were delusional about their capabilities. After the planning session, Zefkari decided to conduct informal observations of human crew behavior. He accessed security, feeds from all 3 ships and watched their final preparations. What he saw challenged every assumption about pre-battle psychology. On the Liberty, crew members gathered in small groups to share meals. They laughed and told stories. Some played games involving cards and dice. Others wrote letters or recorded messages. The atmosphere resembled a social gathering more than military preparation. Veltar forces spent pre-battle time in individual meditation and weapon maintenance. Group activities were discouraged as potential distractions. The Defiance crew engaged in physical training that looked more like dancing than combat preparation. They moved to rhythmic patterns while calling out responses to shouted commands. The exercise appeared designed for group coordination rather than individual skill development. When finished, they gathered in what they called the mess hall and sang songs together. Again, emotional content that seemed counterproductive for warriors. Resilience crew behavior proved most confusing of all. They conducted what appeared to be detailed equipment inspections, but spent equal time on tasks that served no obvious military purpose. Some crew members tended to small plants and improvised gardens. Others worked on artistic projects involving paint and sculpture materials. One group gathered to watch what they called a movie, which seemed to be recorded dramatic entertainment. Zefkari had never encountered military forces that spent combat preparation time on recreational activities. Veltar doctrine emphasized mental focus and emotional control. Distractions were eliminated. Personal concerns were set aside. The warrior's mind should be clear and sharp, like a properly maintained weapon. 18 hours before contact, something even stranger occurred. The human ships began broadcasting personal messages to New Geneva. Not official military communications, but individual recordings from crew members to civilians they had never met. Zefkari accessed the transmission logs and found hundreds of messages. This is Chief Petty Officer Mike Thompson on the Liberty. I want everyone down there to know we're thinking about you. My family back on Earth is probably sitting down to dinner right about now. I hope all your families get to do the same tomorrow night. Lieutenant Susan Parker here on the Defiance. I've got a little girl back home who's learning to ride a bicycle. She falls down a lot, but she always gets back up. That's what we do. We get back up. See you on the other side. Gunner's mate Rick Wilson from the Resilience. My dad served in the old Navy back on Earth. He told me the most important thing a sailor can do is make sure everyone gets home safe. That includes you folks. We've got this. The messages continued for hours. Personal stories, family memories, promises to strangers. Zefkari tried to understand the tactical purpose but found none. Why were military personnel establishing emotional connections with civilians they were assigned to protect? Such attachments could compromise decision-making during combat. 12 hours before contact, the Kreshnak began their standard psychological warfare broadcasts. Recordings from previous conquests filled all communication frequencies. Screams of dying civilians, threats of torture and dismemberment, detailed descriptions of what awaited the population of New Geneva, audio from captured coalition personnel, begging for mercy before execution. Zefkari monitored human responses to these attacks. Standard coalition protocol recommended blocking such transmissions to preserve crew morale. The humans not only listened to every broadcast, they seemed to grow calmer with each new atrocity. On the Liberty Bridge, Captain Morrison sat in his command chair and listened to Kreshnak threats with the same expression he might use for weather reports. When the recordings became particularly graphic, his jaw tightened slightly. That was the only visible reaction. Lieutenant Rodriguez on the Defiance actually smiled when the enemy described their plans for captured military personnel. She turned to her communications officer and said, "Send them our response." The human reply went out on all frequencies. "This is Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez of the United Earthship Defiance. We received your message. We're not impressed. See you soon." Sergeant Collins provided the most disturbing response of all. When the Kreshnak broadcast their traditional challenge for single combat between champions, he stood up from his station and spoke directly into the communication system. "This is Sergeant Pete Collins, United States Marine Corps. I accept your challenge. Bring your best warrior. Bring all your warriors. Won't matter. You picked the wrong species to threaten." 6 hours before contact, Zefkari realized something that made his blood run cold. The humans were not preparing for battle in any conventional sense. They were preparing for something else entirely. Their behavior patterns suggested complete certainty of victory despite impossible odds. They acted like predators who had cornered prey rather than defenders facing superior numbers. The terrible possibility occurred to him that these strange beings might actually believe they could win. Not hope for victory or fight bravely before inevitable defeat, but genuinely expect to destroy a force that outnumbered them more than 2-1. As he watched Captain Morrison check his sidearm one final time before battle, Zefkari wondered if he was about to witness either the most glorious last stand in galactic history or something far more disturbing. Something that would redefine his understanding of what it meant to be human. The Kreshnak fleet dropped out of hyperspace like a plague of metal locusts. 200 vessels of various sizes filled the sensor displays with hostile contacts. Zefkari felt the familiar pre-battle tension flow through his nervous system as he watched the enemy formation spread across the New Geneva system. This was the moment when theories became reality and plans met the harsh truth of combat. Admiral Kethvar immediately ordered coalition forces into standard defensive formation. 77 ships arranged themselves according to doctrine that had proven effective across dozens of campaigns. Heavy cruisers formed the center line with destroyers providing screening positions. Frigates took flanking positions to exploit enemy weaknesses. The formation looked exactly as it should according to military textbooks. The 3 human ships acknowledged their assigned positions, but something in their responses felt wrong to Zefkari. Captain Morrison's voice carried the same calm tone he had used during casual conversation. Lieutenant Rodriguez sounded almost cheerful as she confirmed formation orders. Sergeant Collins simply replied, "Copy that," as if he had been asked to perform routine maintenance. The Kreshnak opened their attack with typical psychological warfare. They launched a barrage of terror broadcasts across all frequencies while simultaneously targeting the civilian evacuation ships that were still loading refugees. The sight of helpless transports under enemy fire should have broken coalition morale, according to established Kreshnak doctrine. Admiral Kethvar ordered defensive maneuvers to protect the evacuation fleet. Coalition ships moved to intercept enemy vessels approaching the civilian ships. The response followed standard protocols designed to minimize military casualties while providing maximum protection for non-combatants. The human ships accelerated, past their assigned positions. Morrison, fall back to formation, Admiral Kethvar commanded over the communication network. Negative, Admiral. We have civilian vessels under direct fire. Zefkari watched his tactical display with growing horror as the 3 human ships charged directly toward the center of the Kreshnak fleet. This violated every principle of space combat that had developed over thousands of years of warfare. Small forces never engaged large formations directly. The mathematics of firepower concentration made such attacks suicidal. The UES Liberty led the charge with the defiance and resilience following in tight formation. Enemy weapons fire concentrated on the advancing human ships immediately. Plasma, bolts and fusion missiles filled the space around them with deadly energy. Any rational military force would have been destroyed within minutes. Instead, something impossible happened. The Liberty performed a maneuver that Zefkari had never seen in 40 years of military service. The ship rolled inverted and used its own hull as a shield for a civilian transport, while simultaneously firing point-blank into a Kreshnak heavy cruiser. The enemy vessel exploded in a ball of plasma and debris. The civilian ship escaped unharmed. Jake, we've got multiple boarding attempts on the port side, Maya Rodriguez reported over the communication system. Her voice remained as calm as if she were discussing the weather. I see them, Maya. Pete, can you clear those boarding pods? Already on it, Pete Collins replied. Hull breach on deck 7, but the bulkheads are holding. Copy that. How's our reactor looking? Running hot, but she'll hold together. Zefkari listened to this exchange with growing disbelief. The humans were discussing catastrophic battle damage with the same casual tone that Veltar used for routine status reports. Multiple hull breaches, boarding parties, and reactor strain should have triggered emergency protocols and panic responses. These creatures treated such disasters as minor inconveniences. The Defiance engaged 3 Kreshnak destroyers simultaneously, while protecting 2 more evacuation ships. Lieutenant Rodriguez maneuvered her vessel with precision that bordered on impossible. She threaded between enemy fire patterns while maintaining perfect positioning to shield the civilian vessels. When one of the destroyers attempted to ram her ship, she accelerated directly toward the enemy vessel and opened fire at point-blank range. Both ships took massive damage from the collision, but the Kreshnak destroyer broke apart, while the Defiance somehow remained operational. Maya Rodriguez came back on the communication network without missing a beat. All stations, damage report. We're still in this fight. The Resilience faced an even more impossible situation. 6 Kreshnak vessels had surrounded Pete Collins and his crew. Standard military doctrine called for immediate withdrawal or surrender when facing such overwhelming odds. Instead, the human ship began rotating on its axis while firing in all directions simultaneously. Pete, you've got too many on you, Captain Morrison called out. Negative, Jake. These are exactly the right numbers. The statement made no logical sense, but the results spoke for themselves. The Resilience continued fighting at the center of an enemy formation that should have destroyed it instantly. Kreshnak ships began to break off the attack as their own. Vessels sustained heavy damage from the spinning human vessel. Zefkari realized that he was witnessing something beyond his understanding of military tactics. The humans were not following any recognizable combat doctrine. They seemed to be making up new rules of engagement as the battle progressed. More disturbing still, their improvised methods were working against an enemy that had conquered dozens of star systems. The Kreshnak began to show signs of confusion. Their psychological warfare broadcasts became less organized. Ships that should have pressed attacks according to their doctrine began to hesitate. The terror tactics that had broken coalition morale in previous battles seemed to have no effect on human crews. When the Liberty suffered direct hits that would have crippled any other vessel, Captain Morrison's response came immediately over the communication system. All hands, this is the captain. We've taken some hits, but we're still fighting. Remember why we're here. 3 million people are counting on us. We don't let them down." The response from his crew came back in a chorus of voices. "Aye, aye, Captain." No. Panic. No request for evacuation. No surrender discussions. Just acknowledgement and continued resistance. The battle entered its second hour with casualties mounting on both sides. The coalition had lost 12 ships while the Kreshnok had lost 31. Under normal circumstances, such losses would have forced a tactical withdrawal according to standard military doctrine. The humans showed no signs of retreat. The Defiance took a direct hit from a Kreshnok plasma cannon that should have destroyed the ship instantly. Instead, Maya Rodriguez reported casualties but continued fighting. "Jake, we've lost main power on decks 4 through 7, switching to auxiliary systems. Can you maintain weapons?" "Weapons are operational. We're still in this fight." "Outstanding. Pete, what's your status?" "Ugly but functional. These boarding." "Parties don't seem to understand that Marines don't surrender." "Copy that. Let's finish this." Zefkari found himself staring at his tactical display in complete bewilderment. The human ships had sustained damage that would have forced any rational military force to withdraw. Their casualty reports indicated losses that should have broken unit cohesion. Yet they continued fighting with the same determination they had shown at the beginning of the engagement. The Kreshnok fleet began to show clear signs of demoralization. Ships that had charged into battle with typical savage enthusiasm now hung back and avoided direct engagement with human vessels. Their psychological warfare broadcasts had stopped entirely. Some enemy commanders were actually requesting permission to withdraw from individual engagements. This made no sense according to everything Zefkari knew about Kreshnok military culture. They were predators who fed on fear and desperation. They grew stronger when facing terrified opponents, but the humans refused to show fear. Instead, they seemed to become more dangerous as the battle intensified. When the UES Resilience suffered critical damage and began listing to starboard, Pete Collins made an announcement that sent chills through every listener on the Coalition communication network. "Liberty, Defiance, this is Resilience, we're done running. Setting collision course with their command ship." The words carried such finality that Zefkari felt his scales lock in involuntary terror response. This human was announcing his intention to commit suicide by ramming the enemy flagship, not as a last resort or desperate measure, but as a tactical decision delivered in the same calm tone used for routine orders. "Negative, Resilience," Jake Morrison responded immediately. "We need you for extraction duties." "Jake, we've got 300 civilians on evacuation shuttle 7. Their engines failed and they can't maneuver. Either we clear a path or they die." A pause stretched across the communication network. Then Captain Morrison's voice came back with the same terrible calm. "Understood, Pete. Give them hell." Zefkari watched his tactical display as the damaged human vessel accelerated directly toward the massive Kreshnok command ship. This wasn't military tactics. This wasn't strategic thinking. This was something else entirely. Something that military academies never taught because no rational species would consider such actions. As the Resilience approached ramming speed, Pete Collins transmitted one final message that would haunt Zefkari for the rest of his life. The explosion from the Resilience collision lit up space like a dying sun. Zefkari watched his tactical display as the massive Kreshnok command ship broke apart in a chain reaction of secondary explosions. Debris spread across thousands of kilometers while the electromagnetic pulse from the destruction temporarily blinded sensors throughout the battle zone. When the displays cleared, Pete Collins and his entire crew were gone. 300 human lives extinguished in an instant to save civilians they had never met. The mathematics of the sacrifice made no sense from any military perspective Zefkari understood. Warriors were trained assets representing years of investment. Civilians were protected resources but not worth unlimited military expenditure. The human response to this catastrophic loss defied all psychological warfare doctrine. Instead of breaking under the weight of such casualties, the remaining ships seemed to fight with increased ferocity. Captain Morrison's voice came across the communication network with the same steady calm he had maintained throughout the engagement. "All Coalition forces, this is Morrison. Resilience has cleared the path. Evacuation Shuttle 7 is proceeding to safety. Continue the mission." "Jake, Pete's sacrifice won't be wasted," Maya Rodriguez added from the Defiance. "We finish what we started." The Kreshnak fleet response revealed something that shook Zefkari to his core. These savage warriors who had conquered 47 star systems were showing signs of genuine fear. Ships that had charged into battle with typical berserker fury now maintained cautious distances from the remaining human vessels. Some were actually retreating toward the outer system. Admiral Kethvar tried to restore standard tactical coordination. All ships, reform defensive positions. We've eliminated their command structure. Now we consolidate gains and protect the evacuation. Negative, Admiral, Captain Morrison replied. We're pressing the attack. Captain, you've sustained heavy casualties. Your forces need time to regroup. We don't regroup. We finish them. The Liberty and Defiance accelerated toward the largest concentration of enemy vessels. This violated every principle of tactical withdrawal and damage assessment that governed military operations. Forces that had taken significant losses were supposed to fall back, reorganize, and return to combat when ready. Humans apparently did not follow these rules. Maya Rodriguez maneuvered the damaged Defiance into the heart of a Kreshnak destroyer formation. Her ship leaked atmosphere from multiple hull breaches and operated on auxiliary power, but her weapons remained fully functional. She engaged 6 enemy vessels simultaneously while maintaining communication with perfect calm. Jake, I'm seeing some confusion in their formation. They're not coordinating attacks like before. I noticed that too. They seem rattled. Good. Let's keep them that way. Zefkari studied the tactical situation with growing amazement. The Kreshnak were indeed showing signs of demoralization that bordered on panic. Their psychological warfare had been turned against them. Instead of breaking enemy resolve, they faced opponents who seemed to grow more dangerous when threatened with death. The Liberty engaged a formation of Kreshnak heavy cruisers that should have destroyed the smaller human vessel within minutes. Captain Morrison used tactics that would have been considered insane by any military academy. He flew directly between enemy ships, using their own formations against them. When they tried to concentrate fire, they ended up shooting each other. Maya, I need you to take point on that cruiser formation to starboard. Copy that, Jake. Moving to engage. Watch your 6. They're trying to flank you. I see them. Thanks for the heads up. The casual conversation continued as both ships fought for their lives against overwhelming odds. They discussed tactical maneuvers and enemy movements with the same tone other species used for routine training exercises. Death surrounded them, on all sides, yet they maintained perfect coordination and mutual support. Zefkari realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. 2 human ships were defeating a force that outnumbered them 20-1 through sheer refusal to accept defeat. They had no secret weapons or superior technology. They simply would not stop fighting. The Kreshnak began sending surrender signals. The concept was so alien that Zefkari initially dismissed the communications as enemy deception. The Kreshnak did not surrender. They fought to the death or they conquered. Surrender was not part of their psychological makeup, yet the signals continued coming from multiple enemy vessels. Admiral Kethvar, this is Destroyer Captain Vashtek. We are receiving surrender requests from enemy vessels. Confirmed. Multiple Kreshnak ships are requesting terms of surrender. Admiral Kethvar sounded as confused as Zefkari felt. Standard coalition protocol for enemy surrender involved complex negotiations and prisoner processing procedures. No one had ever needed to develop protocols for Kreshnak surrender because it had never happened. Captain Morrison's response cut through the confusion with typical human directness. Admiral, we don't have time for surrender negotiations. There are still enemy ships threatening the evacuation fleet. Captain, international law requires us to accept surrender requests. Then accept them. We'll keep fighting until every civilian is safe. The Liberty and Defiance continued their attack while coalition forces began the complex process of accepting Kreshnak surrender. The sight was surreal beyond description. Savage warriors who had terrorized the galaxy for generations were laying down their weapons and requesting protection from 2 damaged human ships. Maya Rodriguez reported her status with characteristic understatement. Jake, we've got multiple systems failures across all decks. Life support is marginal and we're down to 20% power. Can you continue operations? For as long as needed. Outstanding. Let's finish clearing the evacuation routes. The remaining Kreshnak vessels began a general retreat toward the outer system. Ships that had never fled from battle were abandoning their positions and running from forces they still outnumbered significantly. The psychological impact of the human attack had broken something fundamental in their warrior culture. Zephikari watched the evacuation fleet complete its final runs to New Geneva's surface. The last civilian transport cleared the danger zone as human ships maintained protective formations, despite critical damage to their own vessels. Captain Morrison's voice came over the communication network one final time as the all-clear signal echoed across the system. "All stations, this is Morrison. Mission accomplished. All civilians are safe." The simple statement carried weight that would echo through galactic military history. 3 human ships had faced impossible odds to protect strangers and achieved complete victory. They had broken the most feared military force in known space through methods that defied rational analysis. As coalition forces began damage assessment and prisoner processing, Zephikari found himself staring at tactical displays that told a story he could barely comprehend. The humans had lost 1 ship and sustained massive damage to the other 2. By any mathematical calculation, they should have been defeated within the first hour of combat. Instead, they had achieved total victory against overwhelming odds through sheer refusal to accept defeat. They had turned their own willingness to die into a weapon more powerful than any technology in the coalition arsenal. The Kreshnak fleet was destroyed or surrendered. New Geneva was safe. 3 million civilians would wake up tomorrow morning because a handful of humans decided that some things were worth dying for. For the first time in his military career, Zephikari understood what real terror looked like. Not the fear of death or defeat, but the terror of facing beings who would sacrifice everything for strangers without hesitation or regret. The terror of fighting against creatures who made moral choices into military tactics and turned compassion into a weapon of war. He would carry that understanding with him for the rest of his life. The battle ended with silence that felt heavier than the chaos of combat. Zephikari stood on the bridge of the Harmony's Edge and watched the aftermath unfold across his tactical displays. 73 Kreshnak vessels had surrendered. 41. Others were destroyed or disabled beyond repair. The remaining fleet had fled to unknown coordinates and would likely never return to this sector of space. 2 human ships remained operational, though barely. The Liberty drifted on auxiliary power with atmosphere leaking from multiple hull breaches. The Defiance had lost main propulsion and was using maneuvering thrusters to maintain position. Both vessels looked like they should have been declared total losses. Yet their crews continued normal operations as if catastrophic damage was merely an inconvenience. Coalition forces began the complex process of damage assessment and prisoner management. Standard post-battle protocol required detailed reports on casualties, equipment losses, and tactical effectiveness. The numbers from this engagement would challenge every assumption about modern space warfare. Zephikari found himself assigned to conduct preliminary interviews with surviving Kreshnak commanders. These conversations proved more disturbing than the battle itself. Warriors who had spent their lives conquering civilizations now spoke in hushed voices about facing humans in combat. "They do not fear death," Commander Grack explained during his interrogation. His massive form hunched in the restraint chair as if trying to hide from invisible threats. "We have broken 1,000 species with the promise of suffering. These humans embrace suffering as if it makes them stronger." "Describe their tactical behavior," Zephikari requested. "There is no tactic, there is only will. They decide what will happen and then make it happen regardless of cost or consequence. We could kill their bodies, but we could not touch their resolve." Captain Vashrol of the surrendered destroyer Bone Cleaver provided even more unsettling observations. "My warriors have conquered worlds by breaking enemy morale. We understand fear and how to use it as a weapon. But these humans turned our own methods against us. Every time we increased pressure, they became more dangerous. Every casualty they suffered made them fight harder. It was like fighting a force of nature rather than a military unit." The interviews continued for hours with consistent themes emerging from every conversation. The Kreshnak described human behavior that defied all psychological warfare doctrine. Instead of breaking under stress, humans seemed to transform stress into strength. Instead of calculating odds, they simply refused to accept unacceptable outcomes. Zefkari made his way to the Liberty's medical bay where coalition medical teams were treating human casualties alongside their own wounded. The scene challenged his understanding of military culture in ways that data reports could never convey. A young human private, probably no older than a Veltar juvenile, lay on a medical bed with severe burns covering most of his left side. The injury should have left him in shock or unconscious from pain medication. Instead, he gripped Zefkari's arm when the Veltar warrior approached his bed. "Did we get them all out?" the private asked urgently. "The civilians, I mean. Did everyone make it to safety?" Zefkari confirmed that all evacuation operations had been completed successfully. Every civilian transport had reached secure positions. The young human smiled and relaxed against his pillow, content despite injuries that would have incapacitated warriors from other species. "Good," the private said quietly. "That's what matters. Everything else is just details." The phrase echoed something Captain Morrison had said before the battle. Zefkari realized that this was not individual philosophy, but shared human perspective. They measured success not by military objectives achieved or casualties avoided, but by innocent lives protected. The distinction revealed something profound about human military culture. Later that evening, Zefkari found himself in Captain Morrison's quarters aboard the Liberty. The human commander sat at a small desk writing what appeared to be personal correspondence. His ship was barely functional, his crew had suffered significant casualties, yet he spent time on individual letters rather than official reports. "Personal communication to families of the deceased," Morrison explained when he noticed Zefkari's curiosity. "Pete had 3 children back on Earth. They deserve to know what their father accomplished here." "How do you explain to children that their father died for strangers?" Morrison paused in his writing and looked up with those strange two-eyed features that had become familiar over the past few days. "You don't explain it that way. You tell them their father kept a promise he made when he put on the uniform. A promise to protect innocent people even if it cost him everything. What promise justifies such sacrifice? The promise that children get to grow up safe, that families get to stay together, that normal people get to live normal lives without fear of monsters in the dark." Morrison returned to his letter with careful deliberation. Pete understood that promise, we all do. Zefkari studied the human commander with growing comprehension. These beings did not fight for territory or resources or strategic advantage. They fought for abstract concepts like safety and family and normal life. They turned moral imperatives into military doctrine and treated ethical obligations as tactical requirements. "Captain, your people fought today knowing you would likely die. How do you maintain unit cohesion under such conditions?" Morrison finished the sentence he was writing before responding. "You're thinking about it wrong, Zeph. We didn't fight knowing we'd die. We fought knowing that something worse than death would happen if we failed. What could be worse than death? Letting innocent people die when we could prevent it. Living with the knowledge that we had the power to save lives and chose not to use it. There are things worth dying for, but there's nothing worth living with that kind of failure." The words carried conviction that went beyond military training or cultural conditioning. This was fundamental human nature expressing itself through military action. They had weaponized their own moral code and turned compassion into a force multiplier, more powerful than any technology. As Zefkari prepared to return to his own ship, he struggled with how to summarize his observations in the required after-action report. How could he explain to Veltar Command that humans did not fight wars in any conventional sense? How could he describe beings who turned ethical obligations into tactical advantages? He began drafting his preliminary assessment with careful attention to precise language. Human military capabilities analysis. Initial observations suggest that human forces operate according to principles that differ significantly from established galactic military doctrine. Their tactical decisions appear to be driven by moral imperatives rather than strategic calculations. He paused and deleted the text. Military language could not capture what he had witnessed. Technical terminology failed to convey the reality of facing opponents who measured victory, not by enemy casualties inflicted, but by innocent lives protected. After several attempts, he wrote simply, "Recommend immediate alliance status with human forces. Not because they are our most powerful allies, but because they represent something unique in galactic civilization. They have weaponized their own moral code and turned compassion into military advantage. Fighting alongside such beings is an honor. Fighting against them would be a nightmare. He attached detailed tactical reports and casualty figures, but knew that numbers could never tell the real story. 3 human ships had faced impossible odds and achieved complete victory through sheer refusal to accept defeat. They had broken the most feared military force in known space by caring more about civilian lives than their own survival. Outside his viewport, the lights of New Geneva shone in the darkness. 3 million souls would see tomorrow because a handful of humans decided that some things were worth dying for. Parents would make breakfast for their children. Workers would complain about their jobs. Families would plan weekend activities. Normal, everyday, boring life would continue because extraordinary people had paid an extraordinary price to protect it. For the first time in his military career, Zefkari understood what real terror felt like. Not the fear of death or defeat, but the terror of facing beings who would sacrifice everything for strangers without hesitation. The terror of fighting alongside creatures who made moral choices into military tactics. And the even greater terror of imagining what would happen to anyone foolish enough to fight against them. The humans had shown the galaxy something new. They had demonstrated that compassion could be a weapon, that moral conviction could overcome impossible odds, and that some things were indeed worth any sacrifice. Zefkari would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life, and he knew he would never be the same.